to Advocacy by the Book, legal and compliance issues for Chicago's grassroots groups that engage in organizing or policy advocacy. My name is Erica Spangler-Raz. I'm Senior Counsel and Director of Pro Bono Works for Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Chicago Lawyers Committee works to secure racial equity and economic opportunity for all. We envision a future where all residents, regardless of race, gender, or socioeconomic background, have equal access to jobs, homes, education, and opportunity. We provide legal support through partnerships with the private bar, and we collaborate with community-based groups to craft and implement community-based policy solutions that advance civil rights. We use the full range of legal tools: impact litigation, direct services litigation, policy advocacy, non-litigation legal assistance to mission-aligned organizations, and community education programs like this one to advance our mission. You can learn more about our work and to request legal support for your organization by visiting our website, www.clccrul.org, and we'll put that in the chat. The convergence of COVID-19 and heightened public awareness of police brutality against Black people cast a glaring spotlight on deeply entrenched systemic racism in 2020. This spotlight unleashed significant increases in funding by many foundations, corporations, and individuals for organizations led by Black, Indigenous, and leaders of color that are focused on community organizing, movement building, or policy advocacy to advance equity and opportunity for Black and Brown people. This sharp uptick in funding has created opportunities for many new or smaller organizations to build capacity and strengthen their advocacy, but it also comes with challenges. This seminar on legal and compliance issues for advocacy organizations is the first in a series. The purpose of these webinars is to provide information to help leaders in newer and smaller community-based organizations better understand and manage legal, financial, and operational issues. Today, we're looking forward to you learning about the differences between 501c3 public charities and 501c4 social welfare organizations, the types of advocacy and lobbying activities that are permissible, and the compliance and reporting obligations required by each. Thank you to the Woods Fund, Conant Family Foundation, and the Field Foundation for supporting this educational series, and to our pro bono partner, Conant and Rosamond, for co-sponsoring this session on legal and compliance issues. The format of the session today is a brief legal presentation and then a panel presentation with nonprofit leaders. That will cover the first 50 minutes, followed by small group breakout rooms where you get to ask an expert, a nonprofit leader, and a legal expert your questions. This webinar is participatory, and we're here to answer your questions, which you can type into the chat window. We also have breakout sessions today, and we encourage you to turn on your microphone and webcam to fully participate in the breakout sessions. The presentation in the main room will be recorded and available on our website and our YouTube channel, while the conversation in the breakout room will not be recorded, so you can feel free to ask any question you need. So with that, I am going to introduce our presenter for the legal and compliance issues for advocacy organizations, which is Janet Goles-Hoffman. Janet is Senior Counsel and Pro Bono Counsel with Conant and Rosamond. She works to coordinate the firm's transactional pro bono portfolio, and through this work, which is an outgrowth of Janet's approximately 40 years of helping nonprofit organizations find productive balance between their missions and their margins. Janet's past clients include stalwarts like Planned Parenthood, statewide advocacy organizations, as well as small and emerging grassroots groups. And I can attest to this, Janet is known for her calm, visionary approach to complex issues. Janet?
Thank you for that lovely introduction. This discussion will go over a number of technical issues that relate to 501c3s and 501c4s. I imagine some of you will have questions. Please put them in the chat. Erica will help wrangle them and make sure that we get as many of them answered as possible. Not only will I be participating in this, but Robert Barrett, who is one of our summer associates, work was very helpful on the lobbying side, and he will be available in one of the breakout groups to help answer those questions as well. There we go. We're going to discuss similarities between 501c3s and 501c4s. We'll also spend some time discussing the difference between advocacy and lobbying. There are technical differences as far as the IRS is concerned, which are not necessarily the way most people think about this. And then we'll spend a brief time on lobbyist registration. So what are the key differences between 501c3s and 501c4s? The income of both of them is exempt from federal income taxation, but there are key differences. The first key difference that everyone pays attention to is the deductibility of contributions. There are also differences in how much political campaign capacity there can be. And there also is a difference in how much lobbying 501c3 can do versus a 501c4. And we're going to discuss a little bit on all of those. For 501c3s, contributions by donors are deductible to the donor. But for 501c4s, contributions from your donors are not deductible to the donors. Your income is tax exempt, but the donors are treated differently. Probably the most important thing to keep in mind as you're deciding which you want to be as an advocacy organization is that 501c3s cannot engage in any political campaign issues. The consequence of this is loss of your tax exempt status. So if your goal is to be able to be active in political campaigns, look to the 501c4 organization. And let's talk about what partisan political campaign activities are, just to make sure that we're all focused on the right activities. They include endorsing a candidate, but even softer, they would maybe include publishing a guide that points out the voting records of legislators on targeted issues, or providing voting assistance only to voters of your favorite candidates, such as rides or babysitting or other assistance. Now, the other key difference is limits on lobbying. We'll talk a little bit more later on what the difference between advocacy and lobbying is, but right now let's just focus on the limits. For a 501c4, there are no limits on lobbying. However, the lobbying has to be related to the organization's exempt purpose. So that probably goes to defining your exempt purposes fairly broadly, but this is really one of the reasons that 501c4s form: the political action ability and the ability to have no limits on lobbying. So what can 501c3s do? Because that deductibility of contributions is pretty attractive to donors. 501c3s can engage in limited lobbying. The IRS, known for many complicated and sometimes illogical tests, has more complicated and illogical tests with respect to lobbying as well. There's an old test and a newer test. The old test is the insubstantial part test. The newer test is the expenditure test. And we'll talk a little bit more about both of those, but the key is that the consequence for failing the lobbying limitation is, again, loss of tax exempt status. So it's a pretty severe consequence. For 50, sorry, I went the wrong way on that one. My apologies. The insubstantial part test is an old test. It dates back to 1934. Unfortunately, it's not well defined in the statutes and regulations, and the case law doesn't give you particularly clear guidance either. In general, practitioners look at all the facts and circumstances of a lobbying organization's efforts. So you look at volunteer efforts, you look at donated resources, you look at cash expenditures, So you look at all of those things together, and for smaller or startup charities, the general recommendation is to keep your lobbying activities at no more than 5% of your overall activities. And all of this compliance requires documentation. It requires keeping good records of cash expenditures, hours of volunteers, what resources were donated to you. So you can see that it's a burdensome test to me. There is, however, an alternative, and that would be to make a 501H election. There's a particular form, Form 5768. It's a one-time election. It's not optional with the IRS. You make the election and they have to accept it. The trick here for organizations is if you derive your 501c3 status from a group exemption that comes from a church, like the Catholic Church or the Adventist Church or the Covenant Church or another church, you cannot make a 501H election. So that's just something to keep in mind. So what does it mean? If you've made a 501H election, the only thing you have to keep track of is your expenditures. You don't have to keep track of your volunteer hours. You don't have to keep track of your donated resources, but you do have to keep track of your expenditures. And the expenditures are limited depending on the size of your exempt purpose expenditures, which is pretty close to your revenues. So 20% of your first $500,000, 15% of your second $500,000, 10% of your third $500,000, and 5% of your remaining expenditures for you large and well-endowed organizations, only up to $1 million. I know that's a goal for all of you to get to the point where you could spend $1 million on lobbying because you had that much in revenues, but that's in fact what the limitations are. There is a second limit within the lobbying limits, and that is grassroots lobbying expenditures. And remember, here we're talking about expenditures. We are not talking about volunteer hours. So for you grassroots organizations, if you think about the money that you spend organizing your grassroots people, it would be possibly some flyers that you spend, maybe it's a room you rent, but it's not the hours that your grassroots people spend. And this grassroots lobbying expenditures are limited to 25% of the total lobbying expenditures. So if, for example, you're a small organization, you have $500,000 of exempt purpose expenditures, you can spend $100,000 maximum on lobbying expenditures. And of that $100,000, it's 25,000 in a year for grassroots. And there was a question in the chat, if you make a 501H election, you make it a one-time election, but it applies for every year thereafter. So it's just one form once in your organization's life that you have to file that form, but that form enables you to use this method of calculation for this year you file the form and every year thereafter, unless you want to remove your qualification under this. So for most grassroots organizations, this is a particularly valuable way to maximize the ability of their 501c3 to lobby. The benefits of a 501H election is it's easy to calculate. There's no limit on lobbying activities, and you're less likely to lose your federal tax exemption because typically the IRS will look at those expenditures over a 4-year period. So if you bump up past the expenditure in 1 year, but your overall 4-year average is fine, then you'll be fine. So let's think about what is advocacy and what is lobbying, because many people think that what they're going to do is lobbying, but really, in fact, it's advocacy. So advocacy is communications to the public and legislators on general topics. of broad social and economic problems. It does not refer to specific legislation. It does not refer to a ballot initiative. It does not encourage recipients to take action on specific legislation or specific ballot initiatives. But it can advocate for a topic position, such as climate change awareness or gun violence prevention or raising the wage of workers. It can advocate for a policy or an executive order, such as a ban on immigrants. You can also, while you're advocating, do nonpartisan analysis or study or research, which presents all sides of the issue. I think many of you are familiar with the forums that the League Women Voters frequently has, where they will have candidates from all sides getting equal amounts of time to speak. That's considered to be nonpartisan, and that's considered to be advocacy, not lobbying. Also, if you're solicited by a legislative body for a written information about a particular topic, that is not considered advocacy. That's considered advocacy and not considered lobbying. Also, if for some reason your status as a 501c3 is challenged, you can fight that, and that's considered advocacy as well. So what's lobbying? Lobbying is communication with a legislator or a legislative employee that expresses an opinion on specific legislation. Or you're communicating on the formulation of legislation with respect to specific legislation. Or you're communicating with a voter on a ballot initiative or a referendum. Or you're communicating with your members. Now, what's grassroots lobbying? Remember, because you have to keep, if you do a 501H election, you have to keep track of your grassroots expenditures within your lobbying expenditures. So grassroots lobbying is communication with the public, but not your members, that expresses an opinion about a specific legislation, a ballot initiative, or a referendum. So if you think about this, if you want to communicate to your members and you spend money doing that, that goes into your general lobbying limitation. If you're telling your members to go and reach out to the public on something, you're still communicating to your members. If your members are communicating to the public with those leaflets, that's grassroots lobbying. Now, also, legislators or lobbyists need to register. Most governmental bodies have requirements related to lobbying. Cities will have this, counties will have this, certainly the state of Illinois has this. What kind of requirements are they likely to be? They are likely to require the registration of an organization. They may require the registration of the individuals within that organization. There would be a payment of fees for that registration. There would probably be annual reporting requirements. There are probably penalties for failure to comply. And in certain instances, like in the state of Illinois, there are also continuing education requirements for registered lobbyists. We have available to you, which Erica will provide, some frequently asked questions about lobbyist registration with the state of Illinois, and a little bit of a description of an ordinance at the city of Chicago, which is not currently effective, but could become effective in the future. But you may be lobbying elsewhere. And if you are actually lobbying elsewhere, you should investigate what the lobbyist registration requirements are, because you don't want to fall afoul of those. In the state of Illinois, a lobbyist is a person or an entity that communicates with state officials to influence executive orders, legislative action, administrative action. So this is a broader definition than the IRS has. But each body that writes its own rules gets to define lobbying in its own way. And so you need to be aware of that as well. This can include not-for-profit organizations. It can likely include the paid staff of those not-for-profit organizations. And it may include volunteers. There are some exceptions that are detailed in the FAQs that would possibly exempt volunteers from this lobbyist registration requirement, but that's something that is more specific to the facts, and you should look at the FAQs. They'll be helpful to you. In general, the exemptions for the volunteers are where they have relevant information about a policy and they only appear occasionally and they only receive occasional reimbursements, or they're not paid to lobby and they're only reimbursed for small amounts up to $50,000 in a year for lobbying. So, travel expenditures, out of pockets, that kind of thing. There are lobbying requirements at the City of Chicago right now. The new lobbying requirements for not-for-profits are delayed indefinitely, according to the Chicago Board of Ethics Legal Counsel. But I suggest if you do lobby at the City of Chicago, that you continue to monitor this, as it's likely that changes will happen. And thank you. And questions? Any further questions?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions in the chat.
Is that a typo? Let me go back. If you're looking at, if you were asking the question about the lobbyist registration, this is an exemption for volunteers from registering at the state of Illinois for lobbying. And if the volunteers are not paid to lobby at all, no dollars in payment, but are reimbursed for their out-of-pocket expenditures only up to $500 in a year, then they would be exempted from having to register as lobbyists. Now, this only applies for volunteers. And that's one of the reasons that paid staff typically would have to register.
Audio here. So Janet, thank you so much for providing that really helpful information. It's really nuanced. There were a couple of questions in the chat that I just wanted to kind of bring up. So one was whether that was a question about the $500 in compensation. So I think you answered that. Earlier, there was a question about, say there are two tests for the organizations, to do the regular old school test or to do the new 501H election. Is there a reason an organization would not want to make the 501H election?
Well, there are certain organizations, as I said, who derive their tax exemption from, who are either churches or derive their tax exemption from a group exemption for a church. That's not available to them. Other than that, particularly for the kind of organizations that we're speaking to here, I think a 501H election is absolutely the way to go, but it does require you to keep track of your expenditures.
See that, and I agree with that. Sometimes when we work with organizations that originally upon their formation, they didn't intend to do any kind of lobbying activities. They just started out as a social service agency or other type of community education agency, and just the environment that we're in right now has changed so much that they are seeing that the only way to address the mission and the vision for their organization is to really start doing some advocacy work, and that may include some grassroots lobbying or some direct lobbying. And so it's kind of a new information for them, that whereas before it would have never occurred to them, and upon their formation, would never have been advised to make a 501h election because it just wasn't applicable. So if you're working with an attorney of formation 10 years ago, the tests were always there 10 years ago, but it may not have been something that was worthwhile depending on the type of organization and the type of activities that you were doing. So that's something that's kind of really important. We're seeing some organizations that are kind of moving into this space, whereas perhaps originally they didn't intend to do that. The other one that that came up in the chat was, how do you know if your organization has filed that form or has claimed to make the 501h election?
That's one of those pieces of paper in your document retention program that you should keep forever. And if you don't know, I would suggest you try filing it again. As a precaution. To just go back to the question about benefits, depending on the size of your organization, depends on the complexity of the annual tax filing form you do, the 990. Really small organizations only do a postcard return in 990, and where no lobbying information has to be filed, but they're still subject to the rules. And so it would be good to just keep the records in their permanent records. The larger the organization gets, the more complex their annual tax filing is. And at some point, if you do have a 501h election, you will have to report as part of your annual tax filing what your lobbying expenditures were if you have a 501h election in place. So, that's another reason to keep track of the expenditures.
Thank you so much, Janet, for sharing this expertise. I would love to kind of move into the next session or the next portion of our webinar today, and that's going into the panel presentation format. And so we're going to hear from nonprofit leaders' own experience navigating these issues. So I'd like to introduce our additional panelists. Joining us is Amisha Patel, who serves as the Executive Director of Grassroots Collaborative, a 501c3 public charity, and Grassroots Illinois Action, which is a 501c4 organization. These are two affiliated nonprofit organizations that work to win racial and economic justice in Chicago and throughout Illinois. Both organizations educate and mobilize Illinois residents to build real power for working families by fighting for living wage, jobs, quality public schools, affordable housing, and safe streets, and by connecting these fights to the voting booth. So thank you for joining us, Amisha. We are also joined by Caitlin Johnson. Caitlin is founding executive director of Black Roots Alliance. In 2019, Black Roots Alliance formalized operations and established their organization, which is committed to the safety and liberation of all Black people, promoting Black leadership and Black-centered community transformation as they work collectively to build socioeconomic power. Caitlin is also the former executive director of Action Now, which is a grassroots community organization that worked to build power and fight for racial, social, and economic justice in low-income Black communities in Chicago. And she has dedicated her career to addressing issues of systemic oppression and developing grassroots leaders. So thank you to the three of you, and thank you, Janet, for staying on as well as we do our panel presentation. So as everybody can see, the legal issues and the compliance issues for the 501c4 organizations, the 501c3 organizations are nuanced. So I'd love to hear from the community leaders, what are some of the practical aspects of implementing these day-to-day procedures, given the flexibility that's needed by grassroots organizations? And I'm gonna turn it over to Amisha first.
Sure. Good morning. It's good to be here with folks. I think that when we probably some of the biggest stuff is understanding the rules that Janet just laid out, knowing how to set up the processes in your organization to stay right on the right side of those rules. So one of the first things that we did was create a cost share agreement between our 501c3 and our 501c4 organization, because really it's one organization, our primary organization is our 501c3 So when we set up our C4, the point was not to have a whole separate set of infrastructure for that C4, but rather to use what was already set up in our C3. So the cost share agreement really set the terms in place for Grassroots Collaborative would be paying for the things like the rent and the space and wages, salary and benefits for our employees. But if any of that work was done in service of the C4, then we had the agreement to be able to make sure that the C4 was reimbursing the C3 for those costs. So that's, some of that basic stuff was kind of core timesheets, we're still very retro and use kind of an Excel spreadsheet timesheet to like track the C3 versus C4 activities. But that's the document we use then at the end each month then to again figure out how much does the C4 owe the C3 for staff time that was spent in service of the C4. So those kinds of paperwork pieces were key. Obviously, setting up a separate board for the C4 was really important. We have chosen to, I think we only have one board member that is in both organizations, so really tried to keep them pretty distinct. It was important for us. Separate bank accounts, sort of all of that. So in terms of it being, it's definitely two organizations, but there's ways where you have shared infrastructure and shared staffing to help kind of make it all work together. I guess another thing I'll say before maybe Caitlin jumps in, but is really, of course, figuring out what's the purpose of the C4? How do we define what that vision and the goals of that C4 is? So being really clear about the functions, like what's the work of the C3 and what's the work of the C4 was also really important.
Yeah, I would echo everything that Amisha said. One of the things that I think is also really important is to make sure that everybody knows where the lines are, and so that it's not just the executive director, not just the operations person understanding the nuance between C3 and C4, but having some regular interaction with staff so that not only is there training on the front end, but there's regular communication about what the work is actually looking like so that staff are able to understand, like when they're in the middle of a door knock or in the middle of a meeting where their boundaries are. And if you have an affiliated C4, knowing how to transition those conversations and keep track of your time. And Amisha said, spreadsheets work great. There are a lot of digital tools out there now too that help track time in really cost-effective ways that make it easy for you to pull the reports that you need, easy for staff to see where their lobbying expenses are and being able to track it in line with the activities that they're doing. But I think also for newer organizations, being really clear what the vision is and making sure that your structures are both specific enough to address your mission, but broad enough to be flexible for where your vision will take you. And if you really being able to define what is the work that you want to do, what is the change that you want to see, and what are the current structures that allow you to get there, being able to distinguish that between the C3 and the C4 and other structures that exist, I think would make things smoother. And being able to just be regularly monitoring it so that it's not the last minute you're filing your 990, oh crap, I got to figure out what my lobbying limits are, but like do it regularly, monthly, weekly if you have the capacity to do it. It depends on the campaign, depends on the capacity that you have, but some sort of regular interval where you're just monitoring it and you're communicating that to the staff so that at the end you're not hit with, oh, we went over our lobbying limits. And because that could have some unintended and harmful consequences.
So that's great. So one of the tools that you had mentioned was a cost sharing agreement. So I'm just gonna throw that out there as this is something that we help organizations draft these cost sharing agreements by recruiting volunteer attorneys throughout our pro bono network to be able to help organizations implement these procedures and make sure that they can allocate these things. Caitlin, you had mentioned a tech tool for timesheets. Would you mind sharing if there's an app that any of the attendees might want to look into?
So we're obsessed with this tool called Monday.com because it combines project management, time tracking, and reporting all in one app. It's kind of like if Asana and Slack had a baby, it was Monday.com. So it combines a lot of different functionality, and you're also able to just monitor things in real time. There's chat features, and you can tag stuff with like just simple hashtag, like hashtag lobbying, so that you can pull a report on, oh, here's all the things that we did, here's all the time that we did related to lobbying, and you could, lobbying on X issue, Y issue, you can just pull all of those reports much more easier than multiple spreadsheets.
It's helpful. Also, not sponsored, but that's always helpful to share those tools. Janet, so I wanted to kind of ask you a question. For the grassroots groups that are just getting started, what, besides the timesheets, what are the first things that they should implement to really just get, so that they don't get in over their head, as far as like the operational pieces to comply with those legal pieces? Timesheets, cost sharing agreements?
Well, first they have to create themselves as a corporation, right? And then and get a FEIN, a Federal Employer Identification Number, because you need one of those for a bank account. You need, if you you need to apply for 501c3 status. If you want to operate as a 501c4, there is a fairly quick procedure to do that. If you did that within 60 days of your incorporation, it's a very simple 2-page form. If you miss that 60-day window, then there is an application for 501c4 status, which you can file, which is simpler than the application for 501c3, but still not too simple. So, do something in 60 days, get your form in 60 days. What we're now discovering is that the Illinois Attorney General, who supervises charities, is telling us that they would like to see 501c4s register and file annually with them. This is not what we read in the statute and the regulations, which I think are unclear with respect to 501c4s. 501c3s do have to register with the Attorney General, and typically, unless they're quite small, file an annual report with them. So there's just a lot of paperwork. And if you have both a C3 and a C4, you really have doubled the paperwork, because you have your Secretary of State annual filing, you have your IRS tax form, you have your Attorney General form. So you need someone in your office who's good at paperwork and keeping track of things.
Thanks. And just to kind of follow up on that question, was, say we've got an organization that is kind of, in the early formalization stages, and they could form a C3 or they could form a 501c4, but it's likely that eventually they think that they're going to need the two organizations, what Amisha has found out, in accomplishing and really kind of furthering and moving the needle on the mission. Is it best to get the C3 started first, or is it best to get a 501c4 started first, or start both at the same time? Janet, what's your take on that? And then I'd love to ask Amisha and Caitlin to share their thoughts too.
I think it depends on what you really intend to do. If your goal is to be political, if your goal is to be primarily devoted to lobbying versus advocacy, then the C4 is the right answer for you initially. But if you think that you're really, as an organization, going to be more in the advocacy area, then probably the C3 first, just because you do get the benefit of the deductibility of the contributions, and that makes it easier to get grants.
Yeah, thanks. Go ahead, Amisha.
Yeah, I think the thing that we realized, so our 501c3 Grassroots Collaborative was formed around 2000. And we decided to create our C4, Grassroots Illinois Action, I think 2010 or maybe even 2011 with the city elections in 2011. So I think the the challenge and the thing to think about is like the kind of what was known about us for, for 11 years was Grassroots Collaborative. Like that was our main identity. So I think Janet's really right in terms of the like what, who people know us as and who the kind of primary organization is for us had been the C3. So the challenge for us in creating the C4 was like, people were like, what is this? What is this organization that's suddenly around and trying to move things, that we didn't have the benefit of like the, decade plus of work and visibility as the C3. So, and then I think, I have regrets about many things, but like, I think our C3 name was really, when it was created, was made to be deliberately the most generic name possible. Grassroots and collaborative kind of fit that bill. And so when I was trying to figure out the C4 name, I think I have a regret about not making our C4 name closer to, Grassroots Collaborative's name. So our C4 is Grassroots Illinois Action. So we sometimes shorten it by Grassroots, but then again, that's totally generic. I can capitalize the G, but that's still totally generic. It obviously applies to everybody. So, so I do think thinking about naming is important. A lot of times for the C4, you just kind of add an extra word. Given the fact that we were already kind of stuck with a name that was a bit generic, I think I really struggled to figure out the right branding. So I guess the answer to this question is about identity and visibility and who people know and recognize and for what work. And so obviously over the last decade of our C4, I think there's been a bit more visibility for sure on our C4 side as well. But it is a thing to think about in terms of like, for us, to have, a lot of the things that we had to figure out was like, are we doing this work as GC or as GIA? And then if we do it as GIA, like who knows who we are, right? Is there power behind the name GIA if what people know and recognize and where the power we've really been building is on the C3 side. So I think these are some of the nuanced things that we had to figure out in terms of how do we effectively do the work that we want and have people whether it's elected officials we're targeting or other kinds of decision makers to know, well, we're bringing the full power of who we are in totality, whether we're using one vehicle or the other.
Thanks for that. And I was going to ask Caitlin, because I know that you went through kind of this kind of conversation about whether to go for a C4 or a C3 early on with Black Roots Alliance. So what was your take on starting the C3 first? Or what was ultimately kind of the decision for going that way?
So part of our thinking was around more, it was a chicken and egg type conversation. If our end goal is to shift society to greater expressions of liberation, what are the different ways that could happen? And so that could happen through policy. And so that's, advocacy, that's lobbying, and that fits within, the maximum allowances of a 501c3 with a 501h election. But at some point when the policies continue to not change, you think of changing the people who are making the policies, and that goes into the 501c4. And so recognizing, since we were a new organization, like where could we build power first, and where, what sorts of community relationships would we need to build? And also just the reality of where we would be able to be funded. Like, I think that's also just a calculus that folks have to recognize. There are foundations that exist that do fund 501c4 organizations, but a lot of times it's individual donors. So being able to have, real discipline around building that individual donor pool so that your 501c4 work is adequately funded is something to think about in how you decide which organization to start with. And so for us, it made more sense to start with a C3 to build relationships, to support our partners, and create some level of work around a C4 that was still nascent. So, recognizing that also, even something as Janet mentioned, just like a report card of elected officials and their voting record, like that actually wouldn't be good for a C3 to do. It would be better as a C4. And so that's something that it's just to be mindful of, because in some ways, it seems like it's just you're getting information out there. It's their voting record. It's what happened. It's facts. But being able to do it and protect your C3 and protect your donors and protect, you know, your organization. I think it's just something to think about, like what tactics do you want to use in your strategy to build the power or achieve your mission.
Yeah, thanks for that. So Janet has it like right on there where, you know, it's like, what are your activities? What are your tactics? And then with the overall picture, you know, then we kind of make that decision from that. I wanted to go back to some of the questions that I missed earlier in the chat. One was, are there resources listing which expenses are required to track? And I'm assuming this is for 501h election organizations. When it's tracking expenses for those lobbying efforts, what are the actual expenses that you have to track? And is there a resource for that?
It would be all of your expenditures that were for lobbying. So if you know, and I saw the question, it included something about staff expenditures.
Yes.
You know, you would only need to allocate the portion of the staff salary for the time that they were actually lobbying. So, you know, if they spent, you know, a week divided between Springfield and Washington out of the 52 weeks, and you paid them $52,000 a year, then it would be $1,000, right? Because that's, you know, 1 week's salary. So, you know, that in that sense, you do think about time a little bit for your staff, but it really is, you know, expenditures are your out of pockets. If you think that, you know, printing bills, that kind of thing, you know, it's hard to imagine that your expenditures for your website and your telephones would be very much have to be allocated.
And again, this is just the expenses that you're tracking.
Right.
There's a
Amisha or Caitlin, how do you track those kind of expenditures?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to know about Caitlin's app. So we are definitely still way more old school than her. So yeah, we actually, you know, it's really as we prepare for our, you know, kind of annual forms and paperwork with the IRS that we take a look back and we do track the stuff on our timesheet. So it is about kind of looking back at what we've got tracked over the year and figuring out the expense, you know, the value without, you know, to doing that work. So that's how we figure it out.
Oh, I'm sorry, to Amy's point, yeah, tracking not only the staff expenses, but as Janet mentioned, like all of the smaller expenses, all of the printing. You know, something that we've been really curious about is also how to calculate some of the more digital components, like how long does it really take you to make a tweet, and is that tweet lobbying? So being able to just see, like, okay, so is there a person who is responsible for all of the tweeting that you could then assign a value to that time, and then track, you know, how, you know, part of it is, you know, out of 1,000 tweets that you may tweet, you know, are 10% of them lobbying? Like, I think that's a place where I think there's some additional support that may be needed sometimes, because it's harder to calculate, especially if you're like in the middle of something and you're just tweeting. Tweets take like a half a second or whatever. So like just being mindful of all of those smaller things that could be seen as lobbying or advocacy, or even, you know, if you're tweeting and in relationship to an elected official, you know, some folks may draw a line at that and say that that's actually not allowable as a C3. So just being mindful of how that interacts is something also to add and track.
There was a question about the benefit costs for the employee. You know, you'd allocate those the same way that you did the salary.
Yeah, we definitely, you know, sort of kind of roll that into the, you know, when we think about how many hours someone spent working on something that counts as lobbying, we roll all of that into that calculation. I think the other thing we really are very careful to do is not get too close to the line, you know, so that we've got a buffer, so that even if there's somehow we missed something and didn't track something, we're still going to be okay and be on the right side. So that's another thing that we think about. You know, and back when we were doing things in person, obviously, you know, travel would count in this as well, like mileage, hotel, you know, stay, all of that stuff. If it's going to Springfield, bus expenses, stuff like that gets counted in. So, yeah, so those are, I think we generally try to just kind of round up a bunch on, you know, and when we calculate this so that we can really just, again, have that buffer that we need.
And for the most part, these are internal records, and this is not an area that the IRS has targeted for auditing. You know, there are random audits of 501c3s and 501c4s, so you know, it's possible that you could get audited on this. It's not likely.
Yeah, you guys brought up amazing points. So Amisha, just the fact that, you know, when you've made your 501h election, you've instituted, you know, standard procedures to, you know, make sure that you're tracking and reporting the expenses according to the 501h election. And then there's another level, and that's kind of like that ongoing monitoring level to make sure that, like, when you get to the point of kind of getting to the border, even if you're over, you're kind of rounding up just to be, you know, as, you know, clear as possible and giving yourself some space. When you kind of run up into the buffer of where you start considering maybe some of this stuff, we need to think about whether this is the appropriate structure of changing the tax exemption or creating that separate entity and creating the 501c4 action organization and moving some of that body of work into that other organization. So I'll just point out that this is something that we recruit volunteer attorneys to help organizations kind of talk through for their own organization. So you can request assistance on our website that we put in the chat earlier. So I just want to mention that this is something that we do provide that pro bono representation for organizations. I thought there was another question, and Janet, I don't know if you answered it specifically, but it was, realistically, what are the penalties of not following these rules? Which you mentioned earlier about the loss of tax exemption.
I mean, if you're a 501c3 and you exceed your lobbying limits, the IRS can pull your tax exemption. I mean, that's the primary one to be concerned about.
Yeah, there's one more that I just wanted to kind of bring up here, is that we work with a lot of organizations that maybe have formed their corporations, maybe not have formed their corporations, but they're operating under a fiscal sponsorship arrangement. Janet, do you have any tips for fiscally sponsored groups, or even groups that serve as fiscal sponsors of other organizations that do movement organizing and things like that?
These lobbying limits are imposed organization by organization. So if you're a fiscal sponsor, you need to monitor the lobbying efforts of the organizations that you're acting as a fiscal sponsor for, because those limits are your limits, and you need to make sure that the organizations that you are acting as a fiscal sponsor for stay within the limitations that you impose on them. And as an organization, a fiscal sponsor organization, you need to decide whether you are going to allow your organizations that you're fiscally sponsored to lobby at all, or what kind of reporting you want back from them, and whether you've made a 501h or not election. If you are an organization that is being fiscally sponsored by another organization, expect that they may have some limitations, or they may expect some reporting from you. And that's just a question to ask as you're looking at fiscal sponsors, let's say you're choosing between fiscal sponsors, that's a question to ask. What ability do we have to lobby? What reporting do you need with respect to lobbying?
Great, thank you. And thank you so much to our panelists. Any kind of final tips before we move on to the next session, Amisha or Caitlin?
I think just the other thing I might add is, obviously on the C4 side, there are limitations and rules as well. So you can't have the majority of your work on the C4 side be partisan, right? So I think I didn't understand that in the beginning. I thought like, oh, now we can do all our political, like our endorsements and our political campaign work on the C4 side, but the majority of your C4 still has to be issue organizing and advocacy. So it's really a thing to have to kind of think about your organizations as a whole. What's the work that will live where, and to make sure that you're doing enough education work or, issue advocacy work on the C4 so that you've got, so that the majority of your C4 work isn't partisan. So if you want to be full 100% partisan, then you need a PAC, which we didn't talk about. So we also have a PAC as well. So it's really, like the IRS is a pain. These rules are set up to kind of keep us in boxes and to keep us from building the kind of power that we need to build. And so it really is about how do you understand what you want to do, what's the vehicle to use it in, and make sure that you can play the game well to kind of build the power that that we're all trying to build, and not be vulnerable to attack, losing status or losing the ability to do any of this work.
Great. There was just some last questions that came in. And this one's probably for Janet. Can a social enterprise be a 501c4? A social enterprise being an organization that has some commercial activities, selling products or services, which a nonprofit can do. Can that social enterprise be classified as a 501c4 social welfare organization?
Possibly. It really depends on what kind of products they're selling, under what circumstances, how much the income from those products compares to the income overall for the organization. You can't set yourself up as basically a commercial enterprise under any of the 501c3 exemptions from taxes. So it's a very fact-specific situation. So I'm sorry, I can't give you a more detailed answer than that.
I know it's me. It depends.
Right.
There's a final question I just want to get in before we move into our breakout sessions. And it's about a 10% rule. I've always understood that as a 501c3, no more than 10% of our activity can go towards lobbying. And it sounds like this is total lobbying, so it sounds like it's the old insubstantial part test to me.
Likely the recommendation that you received under the insubstantial part test. Since no one really knew what the percentage was, practitioners tended to make recommendations to keep that very low. I think you might remember the PowerPoint I said for startups, there are a lot of practitioners who will say keep it to 5%. Established organizations, 10% is a pretty common recommendation. So you can see the benefit of a 501h election really does give you much more room than you would have thought otherwise. But remember, if you are on the insubstantial test side, it's not only expenditures that you have to keep track of, it's volunteer hours, it's targeted resources that come to you for specific purposes, where if you do a 501h election, all you have to keep track of is your expenditures. So it's not only a larger percentage, but it's a narrower group of activities or things to keep track of.
Great, thank you again. And thank you so much to our panelists, Janet, Amisha, and Caitlin. We're so pleased that you've been part of the breakout sessions. And so for the breakout sessions, I just wanna kind of remind you, there's 15 minutes or so with our experts to ask your questions. This is not gonna be recorded, so feel free to ask your questions in that space. So we have two different rooms. Room 1 is for established organizations to answer questions about changing your exempt status, creation of a separate 501c4 sister organization, like say you're already a 501c3 with a 501h election, you want to think about creating a separate 501c4 action organization, or if you're growing to the limits of like your current capacity in whatever structure that you are. So that is room 1. Room 2 is going to be for newer grassroots groups, unincorporated groups, fiscally sponsored groups, or those who have more recently received income tax exemption. So you're going to choose which room you'd like to be a part of. And then I'm going to turn it over to Jason to give us instructions about how to do that.
All right, thanks, Erica. So folks, in a moment, I'm going to start the breakout session. You're going to see a pop-up on your screen asking if you want to go into room 1 or room 2. As Erica mentioned, room 1 is for the more established organizations with maybe some more technical type questions. Room 2 is for those that are newly formed. So you'll see that pop up, choose which room that you want to go into, and we encourage you to open up your microphones and turn on your webcams so it can be a fully participatory experience and you can get your questions answered. So with that in mind, let me go ahead and start those sessions right now. All right, welcome back into the main room, everyone. Hopefully you had an awesome breakout session. I'm sure many of you wish you had a little bit more time. That's usually the way these things go. What I'm going to do now is turn it over to Erica, and then I'll be here in the background, make sure that we didn't lose anyone in cyberspace, and pull them back over here into the main room. So Erica, go ahead and take it away.
Great, thank you. Glad that we could get some kind of more informal conversations with a little bit more privacy when we're sharing and kind of talking through hypotheticals for our organizations. I don't know if there were anything in the other, any takeaways from the other breakout group. I will share that some of the topics that came up were cost sharing agreements between the 501c3 and the 501c4, and kind of just reiterating that there are two different organizations, and when they execute a cost sharing agreement, there may be overlapping board members that may have to recuse themselves from those or from executing that agreement. But that makes it a lot easier for, say, an executive director to split time, or even the organizations to share space for, the rental space, for their lease or whatever, for their organization. So that cost sharing agreement is really helpful. Were there any other kind of big takeaways that we wanted to share from the other group?
Yeah, I think the participants, we've all really found very helpful to discuss more the differences between advocacy and lobbying. So that was cleared up in the main sessions, and discussed that a little bit more. Also discussed use of a professional lobbyist and whether organizations have done that and what that would look like. Just noted that needs to be registered, and the additional handout everyone will see will have information about how that works. Yeah, I think it was still great to be able to have the small group discussion and get a little bit more information from Janet and Amisha.
Great, I want to thank Janet, Amisha, and Caitlin for sharing your expertise and experience with everyone here. I also want to give a thank you to Woods Fund, Conant Family Foundation, and the Field Foundation for supporting this educational series, and to our pro bono partner, Catton, Much, and Roseman, for co-sponsoring this session on legal and compliance issues for organizations that do movements and grassroots organizing. We will again email you the FAQs on the lobbying registrations. If your organization is needing legal support, legal assistance for kind of navigating these issues, and you are looking for a pro bono representation, please do contact us. We've got an inquiry form on our website, or you can email us at probonoworks@clccrul.org. In September, there's going to be a webinar covering the ins and outs of fiscal sponsorship. October session is going to be covering financial management and financial reporting. And in November, we'll cover employment law and strategic human resources. So look for the information in your inbox in the coming weeks. Again, the recording of the panel presentation will be on our YouTube channel, on our website, so you can review this information with your own organization. And of course, we're here to support you, so feel free to contact us. Thanks again for joining us today.